Ik hoop dat iedereen hier goed Engels spreekt, want mijn Nederlands is geen zo goed. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Groningen. For people that don't know me, I've been developing in PHP for 25 years or so. No, I don't think I think everyone here at least was born when I started coding.
Not me. Just got born.
And I use a mixture of different frameworks. I use Laravel, I use Pure Symfony, and I used React PHP in my most recent project. I'm also a big fan of horror films. In 25 years of coding, I have seen a lot of horrific code, so I wrote a talk to combine my two favorite pastimes, talking about horrible code and talking about horror films. Now, I want to make this an interactive talk. I hope that there are some horror film fans here in the audience. Oh, we've got at least one person nodding. Oh, a few of you. So I want you to be a bit interactive with this. I'm going to be showing a still from different films. And if you know what the film is, shout out what it is. In English, preferably. I don't know all the Dutch titles, but I do have a warm-up. So if my technology is working, does anyone recognize any of these films? The Shining, yes. Jack Nicholson there. Wicker Man's there, yes. The original Wicker Man, of course. And the original Carrie, I believe there's a remake, which I haven't seen. There's an American Werewolf in London. There's actually 2 Oscar winners in this, one in this set of pictures and one in the main talk. But we've got a Jamie Lee Curtis film here, one of her early ones, Not Everything Everywhere All at Once. We've got The Fog and Psycho, the black and white, Nosferatu, the other black and white, and the last film is a Chinese horror film called Rouge, which is well worth seeing. Okay, a bit quiet for the warm-up there. We only got a few of them. So I hope we'll get a few more shout-outs at the other examples, like this one.
Jason.
Yes, Friday the 13th. So my first coding horror is all about dates. No, I don't mean when you're out with your girlfriend or your boyfriend. I mean Friday the 13th, 2013, or 4th of April, 2013. And yes, Friday the 13th, we have a nice example of code that I have found in the wild for retrieving dates from a database. Now, who can tell me what's wrong with this? Well, if you transplanted it to use Eloquent, it could still be a problem in the same way. The problem is that we're clearly storing our dates as a date string in DMY format.
Instead of YMD?
Well, is it in DMY or is it in MYD? Is it an American bit of code? Because that will create even more problems.
It's also environment dependent.
Yeah. It can create a lot of problems, this. Let's have an example of, well, select splat from appointments table. We've got a scheduled set of meetups for the various months of the year. And if we've got DMY and MDY the wrong way round, and we do that bit of code for all the entries from the 2nd of January to the 5th of January, we get entries for April, for July, September, October, December, all because we didn't think like Americans. So, how do we get round this? Always use native date types if you possibly can in your database. If you absolutely have to use strings, use a universal format like YMD. There's still a lot of code that does this. If you ever work with legacy, it doesn't matter whether you're using Laravel, whether you're using... If the data in your underlying database is like this, you've got problems. You have to know exactly what you're working with, and if necessary, change your database.
And what about time zones?
Oh, I'm only here to give one short 30-minute talk. If I was to cover time zones, I would have to cover calendars, which is a talk in its own right. I would have to cover time zones, which is a full-day workshop. And even then, I wouldn't be able to teach you everything.
Okay, I will shut up.
Yes. This from someone from a country that says 8:30 instead of 7:30.
I always try to put UTC times in my databases.
Which works most of the time. It's actually better if you store the time exactly as it is and you store the time zone.
Oh.
You remember about 4 years back, Turkey, a week before daylight savings was due to start, decided that they weren't going to have daylight savings. Now, if you had stored UTC for someone in Turkey, a date time post the daylight savings transition, you would have been an hour out then. If you had stored both the date and the time zone, as long as the TZ database gets updated, and a lot of people rushed to make sure it did and that it was distributed worldwide, you would still have got the correct time. Now, that's an extreme case where storing UTC isn't enough. Normally, it will be okay.
I think so, yes.
But you do risk that little edge case.
But also, it's not my fault. It's Turkey's fault.
Yes, but then you have to factor in leap seconds. You also have to factor in the wonderful fact that you have transition times when we switch to daylight savings. And yes, there is, for those of you that use Carbon, there is an error in date time immutable, which Carbon uses when it comes to the switch back in autumn if you're checking for the transition. There's actually a bug in there, and it will not tell you you're in the transition hour.
Daytime says one big bug.
Dates, times, time zones are horrible things to work with.
It's a coding horror.
That's a coding horror. There's a lot of them with times.
Quick question. Do you know when it says plus 3 months, how many days have you?
How many days in the last 3 months?
In your example, it's a plus 3 months calculation. Is that, would you know how many days that would be? Or does it
No, it's actually a variable. And depending on which month you say plus 3 months in, you'll get a different days difference from month to month. From January through to March, if you say January plus 3 months, it knows that January has 31, February has 28, or does it?
I've seen it depend on like configuration.
It can get quite nasty. Okay, but we're running late, I know that, so I'm sure we'll come back to dates and times later. Next film. Oh yes, a few of you know that one. This is classic Japanese horror, and if you haven't seen it and you like a good scare, it's well worth seeing. Whatever you do, don't watch the American remake. I suffered that on your behalf so that I can warn you not to. Okay. Code here is a bit quirky. Again, it's not using eloquent. There's a lot of code here. But what we do have, and the problem in this code, is we have 2 while loops, both of which are querying the database. So that is potentially a lot of database overhead. What we are trying to do here is retrieve a list of students, and then we loop through that list of students and get a list of course IDs that each student is taking. It's from a school's database. And yes, I have seen this code, and when you had a large number of pupils in the school, it could take several minutes to run this simple piece of code. The answer here is if you aren't using eloquent, but you are creating your own database code, write your own SQL queries. This query would duplicate exactly what that code is doing, but even that's not particularly efficient, but it is doing it as a single query. The big problem here is that it's returning a comma-separated list of course IDs, something that you should avoid doing if you can possibly help it as well. So if we eliminate the comma-separated list and return it as a proper relationship, we can eliminate the group by in the query, and we actually have a query that will run in a fraction of a second instead of several minutes. So being able to use the relations in your database properly is a big improvement on individual queries for everything. Now, if you're using eloquent, normally you wouldn't need to worry about anything like that. It's built-in handling. It'll even hydrate it for you, so that if you want to run within the loop, it only retrieves when you actually need to do so. But again, legacy code you often find looking as bad as that. Learn your database, learn how to use SQL joins, understand the relationships between tables, and whatever database query tool you use, you can produce good, efficient queries working with it. Yeah. I said we had 2 Oscar winners. We had Jamie Lee Curtis on the opening slide, looking rather different at the Oscars after The Whale, but The Mummy. Now, what horrors do we have for The Mummy? Again, it's a database one here. Again, generally one you wouldn't need to worry about, but database bindings. Now, sometimes even with eloquent, you need to write raw SQL, DB raw, and you would use bindings. There are some things that will mess you up when using with bindings. Most databases, MySQL, Postgres, do not allow you to bind certain elements. It's not a string substitution. You cannot simply replace the name of the table that you want to select from with a binding. You can't replace a column name with a binding, or offset values, or sort direction. So, misunderstood bindings. Why the mummy for that? Well, I don't know how good your English is. I'm sure it's pretty good and a lot better than my Dutch. But bindings are the wrappings that... Yeah. Okay, so from, well, The Mummy was 1999, but I'd call that a modern horror film. We're about to jump back in time. Has anyone seen this one? This is the granddaddy of, or almost a granddaddy of horror films. This is Night of the Living Dead, the original zombie film. And Sam Raimi's brilliant creation. So much dark humor in it for those who like dark humor. Night of the Living Dead. So what's the living dead in a code context? It's dead code. But it's not just any old dead code. It's dead code that is still in your code base. Why is that in your code base? It's cluttering up the code here. You don't need it. You've got a version control system. You're using Git. Delete it and put an appropriate commit message there that says why it's been deleted. You've now got clean code. You have the history. You have a full explanation of why the change was made. You don't have all that horrible commenting out. You do not have zombie comments in your code anymore. So use your version control systems. Keep your code clean, keep it short. If you have to put comments in your code, don't comment what the code is doing, comment why it is doing it. What is the business logic? That's the only justification for a comment. You shouldn't even need to be able to link a piece of code to a Jira ticket. That should be automated, but we don't live in quite that perfect a world yet. So, yeah, you might want to put a Jira ticket reference in a comment occasionally. That's forgivable. But just commenting out code and leaving it in there, you are making those zombies. And you are going to kill yourself 3 years later when you go back and say, what the was I doing here? But it's not just comments. It's changes in the code here. We've got a function here, a simple one, add values, A and B. Probably at some point, someone had done sum equals A plus B, or something similar to that, and then return sum. But that's been taken out. And yet we've still got that line of initialization line, sum equals 0. That's pointless. That's zombie code again. Take it out. Remove it. It's not serving any purpose whatsoever but to make your code less readable. What about that options argument? Ugh. Doesn't even have a default. It's not used, but it doesn't have a default. So you've got to pass a value when you call this function. That code wants a serious rewrite. And yes, I have found that code in the wild, in production systems. Now, static analysis should tell you that that is wrong. So someone's CI system wasn't running static analysis. That is a perfect case for a nice code cleanup. Opcache, if you're using Opcache, it'll be exactly as performant as the cleaned up version, but don't rely on using Opcache. And it still doesn't make the code any less or any more readable unless you fix it. Another example here. Yeah, PHP introduced that shiny star operator. So someone decided they would improve the code by using it, but left the old code in there. So you're all reading that code. It takes you 3 times as long to figure out that's stupid than it would if the code had been cleaned up in the first place. So we've got a heck of a lot of zombies here. I was going to do Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, etc., but I thought I'll bundle them all into one. Anyone know this film? No? Oh, good. Avoid it like the plague.
I was thinking the Ring, and I thought, surely it's not the other one.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason why we have the Ring US remake in here is a simple coding horror that can be summed up in 3 letters. And if you're not familiar with those 3 letters, yeah, the American film industry shouldn't have. There is a date or a time and a place where it is acceptable to repeat and duplicate code. That's if you're working with domain-driven development, and different domains require duplication of code. Because it's not duplication of code, it's a separate domain. It might be the same code content, the same lines of code within each domain, but it's domain specific. And when you do vary the code in that domain, if you'd followed the don't repeat yourself principle and you'd made a single function, single method or single class to handle that code, you now have to split that, and you're not guaranteed to do so correctly for every single domain that it requires it. So you are allowed to repeat yourself if you're doing DDD. Otherwise, try and avoid duplication of code. This is a difficult one. It's a very obscure film. It's another one to be avoided like the plague, unless you really like splatter horror films. It's called Chain Letter. It's a really bad American horror film. Enough said. Okay. What is a chain? Let's imagine a users table, and someone somewhere had the bright idea to add a followers column to it, and to use a comma-separated list of follower IDs. So Shirley, ID 1, has 3 followers: Sue, Alison, and Kathy. So, how do we, when we've got a situation like this with a comma-separated list, get a list of Shirley's followers? Okay, select splat from users where followers like %1%, because Shirley is user 1. Except that gives us Shirley because there's a 1 in the number 10. So, it's wrong. Okay, let's fix it. We can use the comma.
Especially how well relations.
It's not normalized.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, that's really.
Huh? We don't find any followers if we do that. We end up, the correct query looks something like that. And we finally got a list. Yes, a lot of old databases did that. A lot of old developers didn't believe that either using joins was inefficient or having to query a second table to get a list of followers was inefficient. So historic legacy code, we do often find things like that. And we have to write those horrendous queries. So the moral of this story, one adjunct to this, MySQL got so used to people doing this that they actually created a find in set function that would simplify the code that you had to write to deal with that. It's still not optimal. It can't use an index. It has to do a full table scan. So it's still not a good idea to use it. Yes, it's a syntactic sugar, but normalize your table structures and then you will never have that problem. Don't be scared of creating new tables. Don't be scared of join tables.
There's no way people still do this, right? When was the last time you saw something?
It's funny you should say that.
No way, right?
I last encountered that 2 years ago, as
I
recently
was
as...
kind of hoping it was a horror fantasy kind of thing, not actually real.
So yes, some developers just do not get comfortable with SQL queries. Even when you've got something like Eloquent, which can help with all the relations, they're not comfortable. This is why companies still use Excel for their databases. Believe me, I know about that as well.
Why use that when you got Microsoft database?
Because Excel has a much better GUI, and it has a ton of functions built in that you can use to do your lookups. And financial people and marketing people love Excel. So yes, Excel.
Excels.
Genetics have been transferred in Excel.
Oh, yeah. Oh. Okay.
Oh, Jurassic Park.
No, we have Brendan Fraser again. Young Brendan Fraser again, I will say. This is The Mummy Returns, the sequel to the original Mummy. And where the Mummy, we talked about the bindings. Here, we have some more binding problems. In this particular case, wildcarded bindings. That is code that I have seen in the wild. It does not work at all. It had clearly never been tested. And no, there weren't any unit tests for this application. You cannot bind with a wildcard like that. If you're going to do it, you have to create the full wildcard string and then bind that string. Now, this is where you thank God for Active Record and other database query systems, whether it's Doctrine or anything else. They take all that away from you so that you don't have to worry about it. But that is still real world code, although I have changed some of the data just to protect the innocent. So, here's another one. And yes, I have found this in WordPress. I don't know of any database that lets you bind multiple against the same name. We have 2 queue binding placeholders there. So we're binding one variable to 2 placeholders, in theory. But I don't know any database that allows that. If you want to use 2 placeholders, they have to be unique, Q1 and Q2. And you have to bind each one separately, even if it's the same value. Yes, you will find that in WordPress.
Of course.
Anyone know this one? It's Michael Myers' Halloween. It's the film. Yep, Halloween. And Halloween brings us back to those wonderful things called dates. I said we'd get back to dates. No, I don't mean the type that you eat that come from a palm tree either. Okay, what is wrong with this little bit of code? Does anyone have any ideas? We're adding a month to a date value 12 times, which should give us an entry That's what it should do, right? And 28 times out of 31, it will. Hopefully that clue is enough to start a few light bulbs going. What happens if we do it on the 31st of the month? Start from the 31st of January.
Hey, where's February?
Yeah. That's odd. Because we're starting from the 31st of January, we're adding a month. At this point, it thinks that there's 31 days in a month, so it adds 31. Gets to February the 35th or whatever it works out, February the 32nd, says, oh, we've rolled forward into March. February the 32nd is March the 4th, or is it March the 3rd? Depends whether it's a leap year or not. So we've lost February. But we only discover that bug if the date is January the 29th in a non-leap year, January the 30th, or January the 31st.
Date arithmetic is hard, and not only in PHP, in every language.
Yeah. There is a simple answer to this problem, though. If we are going to add months, use as your start date the first day of a month. You can force that very easily. Whether you're using Carbon, whether you're using datetime or datetime immutable, it's very easy to do. So for date arithmetic, always be careful and always test your date arithmetic with last day of the month.
Does that work well with daylight saving time?
That will still work because we're working with dates, not times.
It's a daytime, right?
It's a date time, but because we're not specifying a time, what time is it actually going to use when it creates that date time object?
Either midnight or the current time.
It's going to use midnight.
Yeah.
First day of this month will always use midnight. So we will never have a daylight savings issue with it. Now, there are circumstances where that could get a bit quirky. If you use now as a base and then said first day of from now, yes, you would potentially have that problem because you've actually got a time now. If you use today rather than now, it's 0, 0. So time generally isn't going to be a problem. You can enforce that it isn't a problem if you're careful, but you still have to do your tests working with the last day of the month, even if you have to use a time machine to run those tests. Yes, Alien. Yes, it is a horror film. It's a damn good horror film. In space, no one can hear you scream. So why space? I'll give a couple of moments for that to sink in. Yes, that is code from a production system. It works perfectly. So what's actually wrong with it? What's wrong is that the person who wrote it does not understand strict typing or data types, the difference between 0 and false, and had to create a workaround rather than do a simple strict comparison, which would have been every bit of effective. That is a developer. I never found out who did write it. Just as well, I would probably have strangled them. But it's someone that just didn't understand the difference between a 0 and false, didn't understand how to do a strict comparison. And I still have nightmares about the whole of that code base, but that was just a horrible little example from it. Yeah, if you've got a developer that writes things like that, you've got 1,000,001 other problems in the same code base that they've worked on. Yep, 7. Brilliant film, brilliant film. So, what's the significance of 7? Looks good?
Why the prefix zeros?
Because it lines everything up. Can't you see how perfectly straight lines it's got?
Yeah, but they should be necessary.
Not only shouldn't it be necessary, it's problematic. Correct. 7, because 7 is the highest digit in octal. So 08, what's 08 in octal?
10.
It doesn't exist. What's 09 in octal? Doesn't exist. What's 10 in octal? Oh, it's 8. So, let's look at what this creates. This was being used to populate a drop-down list for entering a date of birth, year, month, day.
I'm even surprised that it works, actually.
It works. Or it did work on that version of the code base, shall we say. This was PHP 5 days. PHP 7 would actually give you a parse error. PHP 8, same. Legacy code, you don't always have a choice. But this system had been live for several months before anyone actually noticed that the drop-down did not have a month August in there. So much for user testing. Yeah, it was bad enough that coders had allowed this to go live, user testing had allowed it to go live, and they had entered several thousand students worth of data with date of birth. Now that's all well and good before they hit a student whose birthday was August, and how do we enter this student's birthday? But what about the students whose birthdays had been in September? Because it was entering a month value of 0 in the database. The database was saying, oh, month 0 is December. So, December of the previous year as well. So it was actually aging the student by 9 months and saying they had a December birthday. We have a database now which has a lot of corrupt data. How do we find and fix what's in there? We couldn't. We had to trash the database, fix the code, start again. There was no way we could clean up the data because we could not identify what was a genuine December 60 or September 61. So, yeah, that was a big problem at the time. So, yeah, it might look pretty lining up your code. Spaces would have done it. You don't have to use a prefix on the digit of 0 because that has a specific meaning in PHP. And at the time it didn't throw an error. So that would have fixed it. Simple as that. Pan's Labyrinth, yes. The director of Pinocchio, for anyone who keeps up to date with films. It's on at the cinema at the moment. Pan's Labyrinth. What's labyrinthine or labyrinthine? Well, this is code from Magento. Magento is actually famous for the sheer number of arguments that you need to pass to constructors. And in many cases, it doesn't even have default values for them. So with modern PHP, we can't even use named arguments for the ones we want that aren't default values. We have to pass every argument. This isn't a worst case. This is just the worst I could find that actually fitted on a display slide. The worst I have found is 29 individual arguments being passed to a constructor. Now, unless you have your screen high resolution,
Rotated.
yeah, you might have to put it in portrait mode to actually be able to read the full code of that in your IDE easily without scrolling and so. Yeah.
Super ultra bonus points.
Yeah. A quote from Uncle Bob Martin. Try to keep minimal the number of arguments you pass to any method, whether it's a constructor or not. It makes your whole life a lot easier. Yep, scream. Why do I say scream? What is a scream? Well, there is one thing in this code that I hate with a passion. One symbol. Well, it's a duplicated symbol, but one symbol that I absolutely hate in code. It suppresses any error. The ampersand suppresses errors, so you can't tell if there is an error in the query, in your connection, or in the query that you're making of the database.
So why does it exist from MS-DOS?
This really is a legacy one. There are a couple of valid use cases for it. There. It will still actually return a valid value. It will always return an error as well. Why? It insists on logging something to the screen. We have to suppress that being sent to standard out. So we have to use the @ That is a justification for using it. Not a particularly good one. How many times do you need to use DNS get record? So that is what you will get in that circumstance. Now, one way you can deal with it is to create an error handler. So you can actually trap the error and discard it if you want to. But why discard? You want to know about errors. Your developers, part of your job is fixing errors. If you don't know the errors are there, you're not doing your job. So if you're suppressing errors, you're not going to be aware of the errors, you're not doing your job. So, don't suppress errors. Handle errors, fix errors. They might be symptomatic of something more serious underlying. The connection with Scream is a PECL extension, which overrides @ and it's called Scream. It basically disables @ so that all errors are always reported. Yeah, it's kind of a tenuous connection with the film, but yeah, that's how you would apply it. Okay. Anyone recognize this film? Well worth seeing. This is Dawn of the Dead. And we had our zombies before. I'm afraid the next piece of code is confession time. This is one of my pieces of code. Yes, all those doc blocks have not been updated when the code itself has been updated. So the doc blocks are no longer in sync.
Luckily my editor screams about that.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't line up.
Yeah, good IDE will actually highlight that. I think something like PHP Stan will highlight that now. And there's options for other tools that can pick up on it where you do have a type mismatch. Doesn't necessarily help you with the comment part, but if you change their argument names, if you change argument types, make sure that where you do have doc blocks, that they are synced. So, yep. So, Don't let these code smells come back to haunt you again and again, as they will if they're left. Exercise them when you find them. Thank you very much. Dank je wel. And if anybody has any questions.
We're running a little bit late, so I will allow 2 questions. So if there's someone who would like to start, who has a question for Mark. And if there are no questions, then we can take
What's the biggest horror you wrote in your career?
Some of you might have come across it. It's a small library called PHP-XL. And I actually have a talk that I do about PHP-XL that has the title of somebody's comment about that library. Making working with spreadsheets a little bit less sucky. And I think that probably sums it up quite well. I've spent 16 years working on that code base. I have been trying to improve it year on year. It is getting better, but for so many years, it was shackled by users' refusal to allow me to drop support for ancient versions of PHP, like 5.2, and therefore being shackled to a lot of legacy methods of working with code that made things very difficult to improve. So that is probably my own worst personal coding horror. An entire library.
Thank you.
So let's talk about time zones.
Is there a second question for Mark?
What's good tooling to solve these problems?
So the question is, what is the tooling to solve these problems? Did I hear that correctly? Yeah.
Okay. Good test suite. TDD is a very good way of working because you write your tests before your code. It means that your tests are based on the specification, the requirements. If you write your tests afterwards, you're a developer. You write the test based on the code you've written, so they'll always pass. So use TDD, use static analysis tools, PHP Code Sniffer, PHP Stan, SARM. Use strict typing as much as you possibly can. Always test for edge cases. Example with your dates, always do date tests, but with the 31st of a month or in the middle of a leap year, or with time zones. Use the transition hour to do tests, make sure that that type of thing is tested. A good IDE will also follow things. Log every error so that you have a record, you know where the problems are in the code base. And last but not least, where you get deprecation warnings, notifications, it's a notification. It's not an error. So don't pester library writers to fix their problem for deprecations. They have until the next major release to do that, and they're probably under more than enough pressure. But those are my best recommendations. Make full use of every tool for your CI pipeline. When it comes to testing, even use something like PEST, because that is testing your tests. Yeah. 2 questions, okay.